Imagine a global chessboard where the most important pieces are entirely invisible. The players are sitting across from each other, hands hovering over the board, but instead of moving knights and rooks, they are moving cyber attacks, proxy militias, economic sanctions, and uranium centrifuge. It is a game where a single miscalculation doesn't just lose a match, it potentially ignites an entire region. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on one of the most complex geopolitical standoffs of our time, the current state of the conflict between the United States and Iran.
It really is the ultimate high-stakes puzzle. And the fascinating thing about this specific conflict is that it defies traditional military analysis. If you just count tanks and fighter jets, the U.S. wins before breakfast. But this isn't a conventional war. It is a shadow war. A war of attrition, influence, and thresholds. To truly understand it, we have to look past the daily headlines and apply rigorous intelligence frameworks, things like MOST, SWOT, PESTLE, and spear analysis to decode what is actually driving the decision-making in Washington and Tehran.
Let's start right there, at the foundational level of intent. If we apply a MOST analysis, looking at the mission, objectives, strategies, and tactics of both sides, what is the actual endgame here? Because from the outside, it often just looks like endless, chaotic retaliation.
It looks chaotic, but there is a brutal logic to it. Let's look at Iran's MOST profile first. Their overarching mission, the absolute core directive of the state, is regime survival, period. Tied closely to that is the objective of establishing regional hegemony and expelling U.S. influence from the Middle East. Their strategy to achieve this is asymmetric deterrence. They know they cannot win a direct confrontation, so their tactics revolve around funding and arming a network of non-state actors, the so-called axis of resistance in Lebanon, Yemen, Iraq, and Syria.
So it's essentially a franchise model of warfare. They outsource the kinetic conflict to proxies to maintain plausible deniability and avoid a direct strike on Tehran.
Exactly. It is brilliant and highly effective. Now, flip the board to the U.S. The U.S. mission is regional stability, safeguarding global energy and trade routes, and the absolute non-proliferation of nuclear weapons in Iran. The U.S. strategy is containment and maximum pressure. The tactics? Sweeping economic sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and occasional, highly targeted military strikes against Iranian proxies. The friction happens because Iran's tactic of proxy warfare directly undermines the U.S. mission of regional stability.
Which brings us perfectly into a SWOT analysis. Let's break down the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, starting with the undeniable strengths of both sides. We mentioned the U.S. has overwhelming conventional power, but Iran's strength lies in its unpredictability and its proxy network.
Right. Iran's greatest strength is its ability to project power cheaply. A Houthi drone costs a few $1,000s to make, but it forces the U.S. Navy to fire a $2 million interceptor missile to shoot it down. That is an incredible asymmetric advantage. However, Iran's glaring weakness is domestic. The economy is suffocating under sanctions. You have massive inflation, a devalued currency, and deep public resentment.
And the U.S. has its own weaknesses, doesn't it? We have the military capability, but perhaps not the political will.
Absolutely. The primary U.S. weakness in this specific theater is political fatigue. The American public has zero appetite for another protracted ground war in the Middle East. Furthermore, the U.S. is stretched globally, balancing crises in Eastern Europe and the Indo-Pacific. That stretched attention span creates an opportunity for Iran to accelerate its nuclear enrichment program while Washington is distracted.
But that opportunity comes with a massive threat attached. If Iran pushes too close to weapons-grade weaponization, they risk triggering the ultimate threat, a preemptive military strike by Israel, potentially backed by the United States, which could collapse the regime entirely. It's a terrifying tightrope.
It is a tightrope over a volcano. And to understand the structural integrity of that tightrope, we need to zoom out and look at the broader environmental factors. If we run a pestle analysis, Political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal. Factors the technological and social pillars are currently vibrating violently.
Let's dig into the technological piece first, because 10 years ago, Iran was viewed as technologically isolated. Today, they are exporting advanced weaponry. How did that happen?
Hmm. Necessity is the mother of invention. Under strict embargoes, Iran couldn't buy modern air defense systems or fighter squadrons. So, they poured their resources into domestic drone and ballistic missile programs, alongside cyber warfare capabilities. Today, Iranian Shahed drones are a major factor in global conflicts, even being used by Russia in Eastern Europe. They turned a massive technological deficit into a strategic export. They also developed highly sophisticated cyber capabilities, allowing them to target U.S. financial institutions and infrastructure without firing a single bullet.
That completely alters the geopolitical landscape. It's no longer just a Middle Eastern containment issue, it's a global security issue. But you also mentioned the social pillar vibrating. If we look at this through the SPEAR framework, which adds academic and religious dimensions to the social, political, and economic factors, the internal contradictions in Iran seem almost unsustainable.
That is perhaps the most critical vulnerability of the regime. In a SPEAR analysis, the religious and academic factors in Iran are in direct hostile opposition. You have a state governed by a strict, aging theocratic elite, the religious pillar. But socially and academically, Iran has a massive youth population that is highly educated, digitally connected, and overwhelmingly secular in its aspirations.
They are living in the 21st century while being governed by a 12th century ideology.
Precisely. And that friction produces sparks, which we've seen in the massive, nationwide protests led by women and students. The regime views this internal academic and social awakening as a greater existential threat than the U.S. military. When a government feels terrified of its own people, it often lashes out externally to manufacture a unifying crisis.
Which makes the situation infinitely more dangerous. If the economy is collapsing and the social fabric is tearing, the regime might calculate that a foreign conflict is their only unifying lifeline. It turns all our logical intelligence models upside down. We expect state actors to behave rationally to preserve peace, but what if their rational choice for survival requires chaos?
That is the philosophical paradox at the heart of intelligence analysis. We use frameworks like SWOT and PESTLE to map out rational statecraft. But what happens when the survival of a political regime requires actions that are economically and socially suicidal for the nation itself? The U.S. is playing a game of deterrence, assuming Iran wants to avoid war to protect its infrastructure. But if the regime believes it is dying from the inside out, the threat of destroying its infrastructure loses its deterrent value.
It's like playing chess with someone who is willing to set the board on fire just to clear the pieces. So, looking at the board as it stands today, with the proxy wars flaring, the nuclear centrifuges spinning closer to that 90% weapons-grade threshold, and the U.S. navigating its own complex domestic politics, what is the trajectory?
The trajectory is moving from a cold shadow war to a boiling gray zone conflict. The immediate threat for the U.S. is that its deterrence is eroding. Sanctions have reached their maximum elasticity. You can't sanction an economy that is already entirely locked out of the global system. Meanwhile, Iran is finding new economic lifelines by forging a deeper alliance with Russia and China. We are seeing the formation of a multipolar resistance bloc.
So, the old tactic of isolating Iran is no longer mathematically possible if Beijing and Moscow are willing to buy their oil and sell them technology.
Exactly. The geopolitical isolation strategy is failing. The ultimate objective for Iran right now is to become a threshold nuclear state. They don't necessarily need to test a bomb. They just need the world to know they are weeks away from having one. That status alone provides the ultimate insurance policy against regime change.
It forces the U.S. into an incredibly dark corner. If sanctions don't work, and diplomatic isolation is bypassed by a new axis of Eastern powers, The only tools left in the toolbox are kinetic.
And a kinetic strike on Iranian nuclear facilities wouldn't be a surgical operation. It would be the opening salvo of a regional war that would shut down the Strait of Hormuz, spike global energy prices, and drag the U.S. into exactly the kind of generational conflict it has spent the last decade trying to escape.
It leaves us standing on a razor's edge. We've mapped out the economic chokeholds, the proxy networks, the technological leaps, and the deep social fractures. We have all the data. We have the intelligence. But the most unpredictable variable remains human psychology.
Intelligence can tell you how many centrifuges are spinning, and it can track the money flowing to proxy militias. But no framework can perfectly predict the moment a leader decides that the cost of backing down is finally higher than the cost of burning it all down.
A sobering thought to leave on. As the invisible pieces continue to move across this global board, the margin for error is rapidly shrinking to zero. The frameworks give us the boundaries of the puzzle, but the final picture is still being painted in the shadows. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into the architecture of modern conflict. Until next time, keep questioning the narrative and keep your eyes on the invisible board.